When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World off. K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I am your host, Steve, and we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, including Scott Rank's History Unplugged, James Early's Key Battles of American History, Richard Lim's This American President, and more. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. We are, of course, on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. It helps so much to keep this whole operation going with your Patreon support. So consider becoming a Patreon supporter. There's at any one of the 4 tiers: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. You get inclusion on the History of the Papacy diptychs, probably the most important benefit. But you also get bonus audio and video content, Pope Coin coming soon, monthly book drawings, early content, ad-free content, and much more. Sign up early so that you can put your name at the top of the list. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christine, and John, and Sarah at the Alexandria level, Dapo, Paul, Justin, and Lana, all of whom are magnificent, at the Constantinople level, and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great. Now today, Dr. Carolyn McNamara of the University of Glasgow continues to guide us through the history of Christianity in Ireland and the British Isles. Notice I didn't say the Celts. That's because there are certain problems with that word Celt. Dr. McNamara is going to explain how this word Celt really doesn't capture who these people really were. We will begin to zoom in on the situation in Ireland and how a certain bishop named Palladius was bishop in Ireland well before the venerable St. Patrick. With that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Welcome back to our next episode in a series on the Celts and Christianity in early medieval Ireland and northern Britain. We are going to dive into the fascinating story of a group of people that lived all over Europe. The Celts have grabbed the interest of history fans throughout history. We will explore the history of the Celts and how that history helped them put a unique spin on Christianity. And I am so happy to be joined again by our guide, Dr. Carolyn McNamara of the University of Glasgow, Scotland. Dr. McNamara completed her PhD in Celtic with a focus on early medieval Ireland and Scotland. Now, we have a previous episode. Our last episode was a very broad overview of the Celts. So if you're really interested in that and you want to hear the background, definitely go back and listen to this. But I think a lot of these stand alone, even though they do build on each other. But again, it's always up to you how you want to listen to them. We discussed this a little bit in that last episode if you listened, but we're going to talk a little bit more about this term Celt. And the term Celt was originally a language term that referenced people who spoke a Celtic language, but it has come to be used in an extremely broad way that doesn't precisely line up with the evidence. Who can we consider a Celt, and why is that term Celt kind of problematic?
Yeah, this is a great question, and one I think is good to go over again and again just because of how widespread this term Celt is. So as you said, it was first considered a language marker, and we got into a little bit last time about kind of, we don't know exactly where it originated. We know the Greeks and the Romans used it, but we don't know what it was originally intended to mean or where exactly it came from. But these days, it means so much to so many different people. So we can consider it, as we already said, a language marker. So does that mean that anyone who speaks a Celtic language is a Celt? So if I lived in Japan, but I spoke fluent Welsh, would that make me a Celt? Another question is anyone who makes Celtic art a Celt? But then we have the question, what do we understand as Celtic art? That which is seen in the modern viewpoint today with all of the knotwork and stuff like you see in the Book of Kells is actually a medieval style that was influenced by Saxon artistic styles. So there's even questions there. We can also ask, is anyone who lives in a Celtic land a Celt? We talked about how widely spread the Celts were in the last episode. And today we consider Ireland and Scotland Celtic lands, but our early Greek and Roman sources never call these areas Celtic, not even Wales or Cornwall or the Isle of Man. All of these places we think of as Celtic today weren't called that by our original sources. They had their own terms. How far back can we go on these as well? So we can think about Celtic music. What might we consider Celtic music? We have this as a broad theme, and you can think of all of the airs and really beautifully moving pieces that we have as Celtic music today. But where does that come from? Where do we find the very beginnings of it? So at this point, it seems that for as imprecise and unwieldy as the term Celtic is, we have to recognize that it's not going away in popular history and that we just have to work with and around it. So if we can't really posit a single cohesive definition of Celtic, how then are we to consider the possible existence of a, quote, Celtic Christianity? So my short answer is that we can't, not really. To add to that a bit, when we talk about quote, Celtic Christianity, we're really just talking about Christianity in Ireland or Christianity as practiced by the Irish, regardless of their location, such as in Scotland or on the continent. I mean, that's really how this term has come to be understood, even though it's such a broad term, Celtic. So we see the term further being coined to imply a lack of orthodoxy in the Christianity of Ireland or in, other places like Scotland, which is further a problematic position to take, considering that the powers of the church and the papacy, specifically during the early medieval period, were not nearly so codified and strong as it later becomes and as we view it today. So when we think of the papacy, as it is today, we have a tendency to kind of take this modern conception and place it in the earlier times that we're thinking about. And that's incorrect. So we have to try to avoid that. So all that to say, basically, that you won't find me using the term Celtic Christianity at all. And I recommend that it be retired from our vocabulary and replaced with more specific references to the church in Ireland or the church in Britain or whatever we're actually talking about.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It seems like it's a convenience that works in really, really, really broad strokes. But once you start to just zoom in a little bit, then it completely falls apart.
Yeah, it really does. You'll see this conception of pan-Celtic is a kind of term that gets bandied around a bunch. But as we talked about last time, if you're looking at such a broad geographic and temporal space, there's no such thing as pan-Celtic. Like, it's not all the same. We can't paint it with such a broad brush. So yeah, just the term itself is so problematic, but also so bound up in modern conceptions of culture and history and all that good stuff.
I think you bring up another great point to give. Always, I think people should always keep it in their mind is later conceptions that people have and that we commonly have. The papacy's this way. Well, the papacy, a lot of things that have happened that we consider really traditional didn't happen until maybe the 1800s. And things that were really traditional are maybe only from the 1500s. But we're talking about a time way before that. And it's really important to kind of keep things in the context we're talking about and not start putting on conceptions and institutions and ideas that wouldn't come along for, in some cases, thousands of years after our period now.
Yeah, for sure. And even beyond that, our understanding of the things that we have been reading has changed and grown as we've developed as researchers and historians in the last, say, 100 or 200 years. So we even have to be careful about going back to 19th century or even 18th century materials and how they understood the things that they were reading versus how we might understand them today with the kind of additional evidence or additional time thinking about them.
Yeah, we could talk about that. I think there's so much to talk about there, but let's get into the Irish for today, which is Ireland is going to be one of our main focuses today. What's the very basic background to kind of set the stage of where we're going with Ireland?
Yeah, so I think most people will be familiar. Ireland is one of multiple islands in the North Atlantic off the western coast of Europe, formerly part of what was considered the British Isles, but that's kind of being walked away from more and more as time goes on for maybe understandable political reasons. But in the early Latin sources, it was known as Hibernia. And then in its own language, it's known as Éireann or Éire. And we see a lot of times in the early sources, whether it's in literature or whether it's in more historic types, although we could have a whole conversation on what is historic writing in the early medieval period, we'll see Ireland divided into parts. And there's two methods that you'll tend to see it divided. The first is into 5 parts, or the Coichera, or fifths of Ireland. And that includes Ulster, Connacht, Leinster, Munster, and Meath. And you'll still see these terms used quite a lot for modern Ireland. And we can think of these divisions as like provinces of Ireland. There's another method of dividing Ireland, which divides it into 2 halves. And this is Leth Cuan, or Con's half, in reference to the legendary hero Con of the 100 Battles, from whom both the O'Neill and the Connacht claim descent, and Leth Moga, or Mog's half, in reference to Mog Nuadat, also legendary and an ancestor of the Éigeanachta in the south. So this is a north-south kind of division. And you'll see in the early sources, Ireland is described as a bountiful land that is good for living on. They talk about how its soil is productive and, it's a place to be.
It has a fairly mild climate. As I've never been there myself, but climate-wise, geography, it's all just a pretty decent place to live in.
Yeah, it's relatively temperate. It doesn't have really terrible winters. It doesn't have really terrible summers, and it's not terribly different from where I've been living in Scotland. And, if you think about how far north we are here and you kind of bring that around to the Northern Hemisphere for what most North Americans are going to be familiar with, you're looking at Northern Canada is the kind of latitude, but we definitely don't get Canadian winters and we don't get really hot summers. Nobody here basically has air conditioning, which can be rough when it gets up to maybe 80 degrees. But beyond that, it can be really lovely or even chilly on a summer's day sometimes, but not extreme, really.
And now a word from our sponsors.
When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World off. K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
AI can help you write, research, and solve problems faster than ever before. But there is a problem. Most AI is built on a worldview that does not reflect biblical truth. That's why Dominion Chat exists. Dominion brings the power of AI under the lordship of Christ. All the benefits of modern AI built on a biblical worldview foundation. Your work matters, but so does your soul. Sign up today at dominion.chat.
Yeah, I think that's a thing that's really it from a North American perspective, how far north those places are compared to places that are much further south in North America, but have much more extreme weather as far as cold and heat. That's an interesting thing to think about. And also one other thing, was there a drastic difference in culture or anything that would mark a difference between, say, the northern part and the southern part?
There are some distinctions that are evident, and you can see it in things like where cashels tend to be found most, and cashel is a kind of a fortified settlement type, or where ogham stones tend to be found most. You'll see different kinds of brooches that are found in the archaeological record. So there's some differences across Ireland. Like, it's not a monolithic cultural body by any means. And we can even stretch that, cultural tapestry, I guess I'll call it, for lack of a better term, into the west of Ireland, and discussions on Dalriada, which was a culture group or a kin group that spread across the North Channel into Western Scotland, and questions about whether the Gaelic language, or as it's understood in Ireland, was brought into Western Scotland, or whether it developed there naturally. There's still lots of discussions going on about that today.
Now, how was the Irish society organized?
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up. So there's some things about it that I think are surprising to North Americans, because when we think of medieval, we're usually thinking of high medieval with kings like William the Conqueror, who can command vast swaths of people and armies. And that's really not what we're looking at in early medieval Ireland. So even just looking at kingship, you've got different levels of kingship. So you've got your ri, which is the lowest level of king, like your petty king. He's your local guy. He would likely control a single tua or kingdom. Then above him, you have the ruri, or the over-king, who might be king over a few ria, or kings, or tua, so a few kingdoms. And then above him, you have the rirurech, or the king of over-kings, sometimes also called the ricoichid, or provincial king. And then even above him is the airstri, or the high king, although this position is typically more a goal than a stable title that references consolidated power. I think the name that might spring to mind for most people would be Brian Boru in around 1000. He was kind of the last guy who could really be called High King, although there's a whole discussion around that as well. So the ability of one man to hold any position was really based on his own personal power, or the power that he was able to amass through alliances or dominance of other peoples, or things like that. So it was really you have to prove and you have to hold your power. It's not really something that's hereditary or given to you, or that you can just assume. And I do want to note that while legal records do determine different honor prices or damages that were due to people based on social status, there are kind of regular, ordinary rights that were conferred equally upon pretty much all people. So you might be familiar with honor price in Saxon or Norse society is where we see it referenced to the most, but we've got it in Irish society as well in access to the legal tradition. And as I mentioned, kingship in Ireland and then also in Pictland differed from what we think of today, in that it did not originally operate under the rule of primogeniture, which is where the position is passed down from father to son. Instead, you had this kind of pool of eligible candidates from whom a king could be selected. And this included those who were sufficiently related to a previous king and also sufficiently wealthy in order to support the retinue required of a king, because there were a lot of rules about what a king should do and what he should have and who he should have around him. So one suggestion of this pool of royal candidates comes from what's called the Dervina, or the primary family group, and everyone was part of a Dervina. So this consists of all those people descended from the same great-grandfather, and that's a total of 4 generations. So it did sometimes happen that the kingship would bounce back and forth between different branches of a family because of the way the Dervina was organized, that was a possibility in this pool of acceptable candidates. And I also just want to mention that in addition to actual blood ties and then marriage ties, which we might expect, Ireland had a system of fosterage where young boys and girls would be sent to another household where they would be taught the skills needed for their station in life. And ties of fosterage could be very close. And we see evidence of this in medieval Irish literature, such as that between Cuchulainn and Ferdiad in the Ulster cycle, and people might be familiar with Táin Bucúlna or the Cattle Raid of Cooley as one of the really big tales in the Ulster cycle. So kind of beyond that, ties of kinship were still somewhat malleable. New origin stories were sometimes created in order to explain a situation that existed or to attempt to make a connection to someone or something that was beneficial to the pursuit of power. We see this kind of thing happening in County Down, where you've got the Dáil na Réid and the Ulleth, and the Dáil na Réid trying to claim to be the real Ulster people. So it's interesting how much that can come into it. So I also want to mention that rather than what we might think of as the usual kind of rulership in the medieval period, where you've got your lord that just kind of rules over people, and they may have claim on people and their work, we've got a different method in Ireland. So it's more of a client-based method of organizing society. So if you had a lot of wealth, you would have clients below you, and it was kind of a contractual relationship. So you agreed to give your client X amount of land or Y amount of cattle, and at the end of the year, they would render back to you a certain amount of cattle and probably a portion of your harvest. And even within that, you would have different levels of clients. So some you would give more land and cattle to, others you would give less to. And clientship could even be divided into free and unfree status. And we probably won't get into the details of those today, although even the unfree clients are still going to be above what we consider slaves. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about slaves in a bit. But it's notable that only the free people were allowed to participate in military endeavors. But in this contract style relationship, the client did have the right to buy out their contract and to seek another patron. Although for the unfree clients, this would understandably be a much taller order. And I think that thinking about early Irish law in a contract law kind of way helps us to understand their system a lot and how ideas of restitution for injuries or deaths or even marriages worked.
It's interesting. It kind of has a little bit of connection to Roman law, or the way the Romans conceived of with clients and patrons, and that a lot of the societal problems would get ironed out through that client-patron relationship.
Yeah, I can see some of the similarity there. I think it's likely that in Ireland they would have relied a little bit on the legal system than you see in Rome, trying to do the extra legal client-patron relationships to smooth things out. I think they tended to go through the law a bit more, as I understand it. I'm not a Roman expert by any means.
What was kind of the relationship between these lower kings to the higher kings to the next kings? Was it a fluid relationship, or was it fairly much locked from one generation to the next of a lower king was always going to have to answer to that same institution of the higher kings?
I'd say it's very fluid. We see a lot of fluidity of relationships in early medieval Ireland. And when we look at the annals to see events that are being recorded, we see even alliances are very fluid. So you don't necessarily expect that one kin group is going to be allied with another kin group. And we even see it mentioned in the life of St. Columba, them talking about things will go good for you as long as you don't go against these allies that I've mentioned. And of course, they go against them and everything goes horrible for them. So we see a lot of fluidity. And as I said, above, I guess, even at the level of Ri, or the local king, there's a personal power involved in it that there's no guarantee really that you're going to maintain a position. And I think some of that, especially at the local level, comes out of that ancient idea of sacral kingship, and that, if the king does the things that he's meant to do, the people will prosper. So if the people aren't prospering, then some of that is going to fall on the shoulders of whoever the king is at the time. So yeah, it's not really codified like we see later in the medieval period, where there's always a king of France, say.
And then I think the next piece to kind of build in with what we're talking about here is the Roman Empire. Hibernia was never a part of the Roman Empire as such, but it was really close to it. What was the level of interaction between Hibernia, Ireland, and the Roman Empire?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's one of the things that makes Ireland so interesting, is that it wasn't part of the Roman Empire, but we have evidence that they interacted with Rome. And, we know there was trade. We do find some Roman items in Ireland in the archaeological record. We know that there were Irish settlements in the west of modern Wales, Cornwall, and England around the 4th to 5th centuries. So we know people were going back and forth across. And if they're settling there, then that's within, Roman influenced territory. So they would have been interacting there. We've got Ogham stones that I've mentioned just briefly that turn up in Western Wales. There's also some in Northern Britain, but kind of this grouping in Western Wales coincides with these settlements. And we can see the most numerous number of Ogham stones in southern Munster, so in Ireland. And so that shows a connection between them. And I'll give just a really brief breakdown of what I mean when I say Ogham stones. So Ogham was a system of writing that was developed probably around the 4th century, and its creation shows evidence of purposeful creation. It wasn't something that just kind of morphed into being. If you look at the different symbols for the letters and like the consonants and the vowels, letters that would tend to be really frequently next to each other are in different sets. So that way it'll be less confusing to know whether you mean a C or a T. And the vowels are in a completely separate set all on their own. So you can tell that it was really, considered when it was created. And it shows a knowledge of Latin, and you'll see Ogham alongside Latin in Wales sometimes. And the Ogham itself is a single line, and then you have horizontal or slightly skewed lines that will either go across that center line or just go to one side of the center line. And it looks like it was originally meant to be like carved onto a stick with a penknife that you had on hand. So really easy, simple, short communication kind of thing, but really fantastic system. So we've got that. We've got Gildas, who was an early British ecclesiastic, and I love Gildas because he hates everything.
You can appreciate that.
And he really does. If you ever get a chance to read his On the Destruction of Britain, it's just this tirade of how horrible everything is and how he hates everything and everyone is awful. It's hilarious and I love it.
Sounds like my kind of guy.
So he talks about the Irish and the Picts, coming, he says, quote, from across the sea, which we can have a whole discussion on what exactly he means by across the sea for the Picts. But the Irish and the Picts attacking the Britons. So we know from his firsthand account, that this was something that was happening. We also have Patrick, who tells us that he was kidnapped by Irish raiders. We'll get into him in a little bit, so I won't go into any more detail here, but he's another source. And we've also got the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who talks also about Irish and Pictish raids at the end of the 4th century. So we've got a lot of evidence that these people are interacting, and we've got Irish people and culture coming into Western Britain, and we've got some evidence of Roman influence going the other way. So even on top of this, we can think about how physically and geographically close Ireland is to the island of Britain, even though through the fact that it's been possible for many years for someone to take an early morning ferry from one side to the other, spend the day shopping, and then take a later ferry back home on the same day. And that's not to suggest that that's what 4th century sailors would do, but it does give us some idea of the distances that we're working with.
And now a word from our sponsors.
When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World off, K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
AI can help you write, research, and solve problems faster than ever before. But there is a problem. Most AI is built on a worldview that does not reflect biblical truth. That's why Dominion Chat exists. Dominion brings the power of AI under the lordship of Christ. All the benefits of modern AI built on a biblical worldview foundation. Your work matters, but so does your soul. Sign up today at dominion.chat.
And more or less, how long would it have taken in ancient times to make that crossing, approximately?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've done a little bit of thinking on, how long it might take for an early medieval boat to go and what kind of distances they might be able to travel in a single day. So across most of the Irish Sea, it's approximately 50 kilometers from a few close points between Ireland and Wales. Or you could use the Isle of Man as a stopover, which is itself 50 kilometers from either side. So the narrower crossings are going to be between the North Ards Peninsula in Northern Ireland. So that's going to be in modern County Down, and the Rins of Galloway in what's now southern Scotland. Those are about 41 kilometers apart, or about 25 and a half miles. The very, very narrowest crossing is between the North Antrim coast, again in Northern Ireland, and the Mole of Kintyre in Scotland, which is approximately 21 kilometers or 13 miles apart. And on a clear day, it's possible to make out houses on the other side clearly enough to count the windows on them. I know this because I've done it. It's amazing. And then in the 14th to 16th centuries, signal fires were lit on the North Antrim coast that would signal to men in Scotland that reinforcements were needed. And then those reinforcements could be on the ground in Antrim within 8 hours via a sailing ship. So based on a few studies that I've looked at that have gone into much more detail than myself, it's been presumed that an early medieval ship in good weather could have comfortably traveled around 90 kilometers in a day. And that presumes a 9-hour sailing day and an average speed of about 10 kilometers per hour, which, according to the research, is rather doable in an early medieval boat. And I say sailing, a lot of these ships would have had a dual ability to row and to sail.
Was it ever because that is such a short amount of time. That's a day, 2 days, maybe on the very worst, a 3 day if you're really unlucky. Did the Romans ever have eyes on conquering Ireland that you know of?
They did. I forget who was talking about it, but I know that they had plans to conquer Ireland, and some initial plans were discussed, but they ended up having to recall themselves out of Britain completely, I think, before they could really make an attempt on it. And I do think personally that they would have had quite the time of trying to do it, just depending on how much they were able to get some clientship relationships with local Irish kings, if it was going to go the way it did in southern Britain or if it was going to go the way it did in northern Britain.
Yeah, it could be either really easy if it's kind of a domino effect, or if they played it wrong like they've done and like they had did in other areas, then it would cause all sorts of problems along the way, all those complicated relationships. But so really in the end, that sea was more of a highway than it was a barrier, really, as far as cultural mixing and communication between Britain and Ireland.
For sure. And there's deep time trade that was going on between those areas and between them and the continent. So we have a tendency, I think, as modern people to view the sea as a barrier. It feels like a lot more effort today to get from Wales to Ireland and have to take a boat, or to get out to one of the islands in the Hebrides, you have to drive to the port and then you have to take the boat. But really, this is a newer method of travel, focusing on land as the primary or preferred method of travel versus the sea. Like, there's no mountains you have to climb. There's no bogs you have to cross. It's going to be a really nice straight shot to get from one place to another. And that's one thing I've really learned driving around in Scotland is it's never a straight shot to get anywhere. All of the roads have to wind here and there and around that loch and between those giant hills.
Yeah, I would have to imagine, especially at that time, to go the 50 kilometers between Ireland and Scotland or Wales was a lot faster than it would have been to go from somewhere in Ireland 50 kilometers by land.
Yeah, and a lot of that is going to be determined by just what the terrain looks like. And in some areas, you've got fine terrain for traveling around, and in others, it's very hilly or very marshy. I think there's just a lot more emphasis on water-based travel in the early period than we appreciate a lot of the times as modern people.
Now, this leads us into our conversation on Christianity in Ireland. We're going to really focus on two major players or characters in the story now that we've kind of laid our groundwork for Ireland. And our first one we're going to talk about is Palladius. We'll get into the much more familiar character that I think everybody knows of, but Palladius is fascinating himself. Who was Palladius and what did he play in this whole conversion of Ireland and introducing Christianity into Ireland?
Yeah, Palladius, I think, is likely a name that you'll have never heard of in relation to the conversion of Ireland, but he is really important. So while Patrick gets all the glory, and we will be talking about how much of that glory he actually deserves, Palladius is understood to have reached Ireland first and is said to have been its first bishop. So we know a little bit about Palladius. He was born around AD 408 to a noble Gaulish family, which held high status positions in the church in Gaul. We even have a surviving poem about him written by a contemporary of his, the pagan poet Rutilius Claudius Nematianus. We're told that Palladius had a wife and children whom he abandoned to pursue the religious life in Rome. So we're told in the Chronicle of Prosper of Aquitaine, who is a fairly well-known cleric from that time, and he was from the first half of the 5th century, that Pope Celestine I sent Palladius as the first bishop, quote, to the Irish believing in Christ in AD 431. So I quoted this bit because I think it's a really important statement and has some big implications that we should take a moment to discuss. So Palladius isn't sent as apostle to the Irish, which we might have expected, and that's a moniker that we do see applied to Patrick later. We don't see a command to convert to the Irish. Instead, he's sent as a bishop to the Irish that already believe in Jesus, who are already Christian. So this suggests that Ireland has been exposed to Christianity at some point between the early 4th century and the early 5th century. It's likely that this was a result of contact with Rome or with Roman-controlled areas such as modern Wales. We may also want to note that this happened in the context of Nestorian and Pelagian heresies, which I know you've already discussed on the show. And Palladius had already suggested that Celestine send Germanus to combat Pelagianism in Britain. So it's possible that Palladius was sent either to counteract concerns of Pelagianism in Ireland or just help keep the Irish on the right path in their conversion. So later Irish authors such as Muircheartaigh, who lived in the 7th and 8th centuries, claimed that Palladius was poorly received by the Irish and that he quickly left the island without having any real effect on it. But we should be really wary of this claim for 2 reasons. First, that Muircheartaigh was writing a good 2 centuries after the events themselves. And I think most importantly, he was a biographer of Patrick. So he had a vested interest in playing down Palladius's role and increasing the prestige of Patrick. Prosper, on the other hand, writes that Palladius, quote, made the barbarian island Christian, which may suggest that in addition to efforts that he had for the Irish already believing in Christ, that he may have done a little bit of conversion as well. But really, aside from a few early place names that suggest Palladius may have been active in the modern counties of Kildare and Meath, there's really very little that we know about Palladius's work in Ireland.
There's always an interest with Christianity as it spread, and a push and a pull between common people, and it's spreading that way, and then it's spreading through kings, and then kings and leadership imposing it onto the people. At that earliest time, were leaders and kings adopting Christianity along with common people? Do we know how much and in which way Christianity was kind of diffusing through Ireland?
Through Palladius, we really don't know, but Patrick tells us a decent bit about who he was working with, and we'll see as we get into talking about him that he seems to have worked a lot with younger people, and I think that might have been part of what got him in a bit of trouble sometimes, but we see him talking a lot about the youth of the higher status people, so that might suggest that it's possible that some of the kings might have been making these decisions, but there's definitely also mentions of lower status people. He talks about slaves specifically as well.
When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World off, K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
AI can help you write, research, and solve problems faster than ever before. But there is a problem. Most AI is built on a worldview that does not reflect biblical truth. That's why Dominion Chat exists. Dominion brings the power of AI under the lordship of Christ. All the benefits of modern AI built on a biblical worldview foundation. Your work matters, but so does your soul. Sign up today at dominion.chat.